In this lecture, we are going to be going over how to create your first Titanium Studio app. By the end of the lecture, you will have a better understanding of views and windows. You will learn how to create custom JavaScript files and import those files into your project. You will also have a better understanding of folder structure in the Titanium Studio projects that you create. The first UI element that you should be familiar with is a window. A window is a container that will hold various views. The two most commonly used properties of the window are the title and navbar hidden. The title is the text that displays on the top of the screen, and the navbar hidden, if set to true, will hide that bar. After a window has been created, you call the function open to display that window. If you are using a navigation group, which we will discuss in another lecture, you would call that group's open window and then pass that window as a parameter. In most circumstances, you will only have a single window displaying at one time, the exception being with the iPad split navigation window. In that instance, you will have a detail window and a navigation window. If you are following the model view controller pattern, which I suggest you do, it is also important to think of the window as maybe the controller. You do not want a view talking to another view. You would rather have the view talk to the window, which would then delegate information back to the other views. Inside of your window, you will have one or more views. You can have as many views as you would like inside a window or inside another view. The view is the base type for all UI widgets in Titanium Studio. And creating a view and using its properties will become second nature by the end of this project. You will also notice the height property, which is set to 25 dp. You can use dp, which is density pixels, or you can use a percentage. Inside of our project, we are going to have a resources folder. This is a root folder for all Titanium Studio projects. Inside our resources folder, you will have the images folder, a model folder, a lib folder, and a UI folder. The images will contain any images that we use in our project. The model folder will be any files that talk to a database or web service. The lib folder will contain any utilities that we are creating or libraries that we use for multiple files. And the UI folder, which is user interface, will contain all of the display files. Inside the UI folder, we will have the common, handheld, and tablet folders. The common folder will be for any files that are not device or OS specific. The handheld or tablet folder will have an OS specific folder if it is needed. A quick example would be in the UI common folder we have a file called leftview.js. This would be a file that is not device or OS specific. What that function does is create a view which is then returned. In Titanium Studio, you then use the module exports and export the function. In another file, you would then use var to create a variable and then left view, and then you will use the keyword require with the path to the file. Notice that you will not use the .js. That is because by default, Titanium Studio knows to look for a .js file. If you include the .js, it will actually cause an error. We would then create a variable left view and instantiate the view that was returned in the leftview.js. The best way to learn is by doing, so go ahead and open your Titanium Studio and we're going to build our very first app. Start by right-clicking the Project Explorer on the left-hand side. If it doesn't exist, you can select Window and then Reset Perspective to have it appear. From the Project Explorer, select New and Mobile App Project or Project. If you select New Project, then you must select Mobile App Project in the next window. From here, we are presented with two different options, the Alloy and Classic. Alloy is a framework that's built on top of Titanium Studio. For our projects, we are going to be working on the Classic framework instead of the Alloy, so select Classic and then Default. You must now enter a project name. For this project, we are going to call it Test App. For the location, you can use your default location or anywhere you want to store the project. For the app ID, what you do is enter com.yourbusinessname, so whatever the name of your business is, dot the name of the app. At this point, it's probably good to recognize that you should probably go register your app ID with the iTunes Store and the Google Play Store, just because you don't want to build an app and then have that app ID be used already. So that way you know that what app names have been taken or what. Next, you'll enter your company URL. Then you can select which version of Titanium Studio's SDK you want to use, and also what deployment targets you want to use, like Android, Blackberry, iPhone, iPad. I like to keep them all checked. Since we selected a default app project, what we have is our resources folder like we talked about earlier, and inside of that you have the Android, Blackberry, and iPhone folders. These are just the splash images and the icons for each one of those devices. By default, they provide you with app icons, which is actually very helpful when we are going to be creating our app icons. We don't have to look up every file size, we just have to replace the ones that they have with the images that you create. Every app will go first into the app.js file. In this file, you usually will set up a navigation group, or you will just have a window which you open, and from there you will call your other windows. The default sets up this tab group, which is where you have the buttons at the bottom of the page, and you select one button and it will open one window. If you select the other tab on the bottom, it will open a new window. I'll go ahead and run it just so you can see what it looks like. To run it, you right click on the project and then go down to either debug or run as. Debug is if you want to set breakpoints. Run as is just to run the project as normal. What this is going to do is build your iOS simulator. I like to use the iOS simulator over the Android simulator because the Android simulator can take a long time to build. See, we have our tab 1 and our tab 2. When we select the tab 2 window pops up. When we select tab 1, the tab 1 window pops up. I'll now go through that code and show you what it's doing, and then we'll erase it and start doing our own stuff. You'll notice that the tab group is the group that's going to handle the control with that button. For the tab group, you must have a window and a tab for each one of the windows you want to display. For this example, they used window 1, and they set a title. The title is what's going to be displayed in the top right here. And then they must attach that window to the tab. And when they open the tab group, they have already added that tab to the tab group. And then they select open, which is actually going to display the windows. So they also created a label, and by default all views are centered in the middle of the screen, so it's going to center from both vertical and horizontal, and it will display that label right here in the middle. If they were to set a left extent, like a left of 5, that label would start right here. Well, depending on the width, because since the width is set to auto, let's say the width was set to 200 dp, which would be around right here. If it was set to 200 dp and the left was set, then that label would probably show up around right here since its text aligned is in the center. And also they set the font size and the font family. The font property is one of the more unusual properties in all of the Titanium Studio objects because it's the only one that has an object within an object. So this is a font object which has a font property of font size and font family. And it's also an object within the Titanium Studio label. Well, let's go ahead and erase some of the stuff that they have done. What we're going to do is just have a window. And we'll set the background color to green, just to know that the window is showing up correctly. And then to open the window, we must call the function open. So here we see that our window is displaying. You'll notice that that title bar is not there, and that's because we are not using a navigation group. If we were using a navigation group, that title automatically shows up. You remember earlier we would create a UI folder inside our resources folder. This is going to hold all of the design elements in our app. Within the UI folder we use a common folder, which is not device or OS specific. And we also have a handheld folder and a tablet folder. Since we are just using this as an example, we'll just be using the common folder for right now. And what I'll do is I'll create a new view called the left view. sure you specify .js so that it realizes that it's a JavaScript file. If you don't put it and you add it later, then sometimes the text predictor does not work correctly. From here, we'll create a function which is left view, like we used in our example, in our notes. And then we have to remember that we always export by using module exports. The predictive text comes up to help you. Left view. And this will just be a view, TI/UI, create view, and return view. And just so we know that it exists, we'll use a background color of red. If you want to know all the properties, which there's probably around 50 for the view, you have to look at the documentation. We won't be going over every single one of them because it would take too long. Let's also put a width of 50%. And what this will do is it will add a left view to our window. We're going to add it to here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our require, which is going to be the left view, and then require UI. So everything is automatically in the resources folder, so you don't have to do anything with that. UI, which is right here, then common, and then left view. Letter capitalization does matter, so make sure that you have the correct case for it. And remember, we also do not include the .js because that will cause an error. If you also can remember, this right here would cause an error because what we haven't done is, if you look at what the left view requires returning, it's actually returning a function, not an object. And that function would have to be instantiated, meaning it has to be, you have to either use a new .leftView. We could export that and then you wouldn't have to instantiate it, but since we're not instantiating it, we're just returning that function. We must then create another variable, left view, and say new left view. So right now what we're doing is we have a green window and a red view that's going to be added to that green window. And let's go ahead and build the project. You'll notice that this is taking up 50% of the total width of its parent, this view's parent. So since we wanted this to be on the left, what we need to do is then specify a left 0. Notice we don't have to put DP right here, and that's because 0 is always going to be 0. So now we have our left view, which is now showing up on the left side of the screen. The next thing I want to go over is something called event listeners. If you've used JavaScript at all, you're probably somewhat familiar with what event listeners are. If not, then I've got this diagram to help walk you through it. So what we have is a window with a view, and that view has a button on it. So the window has added a view and the view has added a button. The button has a click event. On the button you would say add event listener and then add the string click, and then the next parameter is a function. So the first parameter would be a string and the second parameter would be a function. With the click listen event, the button has a click event. It will then, after it's handled within this button, it will then be checked by its parent view, which would be the view. And it will say, does this view have an event listener for the click event? If it does, then go to that view's click event listener and handle it. Otherwise, no, and check to see if that view's parent has an event listener. If this view doesn't have an event listener and this view does have an event listener, or this window has an event listener, it will go from the button click event and it will say no, and then it will check and see if this has an event listener. If it does, then it will be handled by that event listener. If it doesn't, then the only event listener that was used would be this button's click event and nothing else. If you wanted it to go to this view and not this window, you can also use the .cancel bubble, which would then prevent it from going on to any other parent views. So let's go ahead and add an event listener. We're going to start by creating a label inside this left view. We can either create a var label, or we can just use self.add ti.ui create label, and this is the property of text, which is going to show the left view. Let's actually show left view. But in order to use the event listener, we will have to take it out and create it as a separate object so that we can add the event listener to it. A left label, and then add that label. We'll then create a left label.add event listener. An event listener will always pass one parameter, and that parameter will have the following e.source, which will be the label or wherever the event listener was called from. So if we want to display the text that is within this label, we will call eSource.text. But a better way of handling it is the function getText, because then you make sure that you have the latest version of the text. So we have our left view label. When we click on it, it's going to display the text that was within that left label. Next, let's add an event listener to the window. So window add event listener will also be able to hear this click event that is fired from the left view label. And we're going to put an alert from a window just so we can see which window event listener is being called. Also, this is a good point where we can start and add a breakpoint just to test the debug. So we double click on the left side of the screen and then select our simulator that we want to use. And so what's going to happen, I'll put a breakpoint here as well. And so what's going to happen when we click on that left label, it's going to first come to this label because that's the label that is actually being clicked, and then it will go through the parent label and it will check and see if that has an event listener for click. Since it does not have an event listener for click, it will then go to the window event listener and then fire from here. So we have called our left label, and you'll notice from here you can also see the different variables that are being shown. E is the object that is being passed into that event listener, which has an X and a Y, and that's where the location of the click took place. Bubbles, which is what is showing, yes, it is going to be bubbling from the parent, or from the source to the parent, and then cancel bubble is false. If we put cancel bubble true, then the app event listeners would stop at that point. So now we continue on our debug, and we've hit our left view, which is now going to stop at the alert on the window. So our breakpoint stopped here as well. We continue, by the way, so this top is resume, this is step into, that means you're stepping into a function or going deeper into the code. Stepping over means you skip over that function if it's a function. If it's just a property, then you would just step into it like normal. So now we resume, and it should show the alert of the window. And just to show you how the cancel bubble works, you type e cancel bubble equals true. So now, since we are canceling the bubble, we'll only be getting this first event and not the second event. Well, that should be enough for right now. In our next lecture, we're going to be going over design.